Thank you. Thank you very much.
Turn your speaker on. Push the button in the back. Green light on. I'll come get it.
No lights are on. Is it unplugged?
No, it's not unplugged.
Hello. You gonna get it, Lynn?
There, it's on now, isn't it?
Yes, I can hear the echo.
All right, good.
Thanks for the invitation. I have decided this evening to use the PowerPoint so it will be illustrated. I put that PowerPoint together in Santa Fe 10 years ago. I gave this talk down there 3 times, and in all 3 cases, the projectors weren't working, so you're the first to see it. I want you to imagine as we go through introducing a few people and following them through this story, what you would have done had you been that person. 160 years ago this fall, a group of Mormon militiamen, assisted by some southern Paiutes, murdered 120 men, women, and children in one of America's most heinous mass killings. These families, mostly from northwestern Arkansas, were headed for California. Only 17 children aged 6 and under survived. The atrocity took place in an isolated high mountain valley in southern Utah, late in the afternoon of Friday, September 11th, 1857. The first travelers to reach Los Angeles on the Southern Road. I'm not there yet.
Oh, sorry.
I didn't signal.
Okay. I saw you blink.
Maybe I'll just do this.
Yeah,
The first travelers to reach Los Angeles on the Southern Road reported an Indian massacre, but veterans of the trail knew better. While Paiutes often snatched cattle or horses, they did not commit mass killings. Speculation soon focused on the Mormon settlers and their leader, Brigham Young. But why would people who generally led decent, nonviolent lives before and after the massacre do such a thing? These and other questions have driven the search for understanding in countless retellings of the story over a past century and a half. Nearly 30 years ago, a group of descendants of the perpetrators and the families of the victims literally joined hands in an endeavor at reconciliation. With the financial support of the state of Utah and the cooperation of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, they built a monument overlooking Mountain Meadows to remember the dead. That project triggered a new interest in writing about the massacre. I joined with my colleagues Ronald Walker and Richard Turley in 2001 in an effort to make sense of conflicting sources and controversial theories about what caused this tragic event. We found convincing evidence that the massacre was planned and carried out by local settlers. One of the participants admitted that the Mormons did most of the killing. We also concluded that the murders would not have happened without the tension created by the Utah War. Ultimately, the killings took place because of choices made by individuals. Our findings reminded us that even the best of us is capable of doing evil. As Shakespeare demonstrated in his great tragedies, good and great men struggle with their flaws of character, and sometimes, as did the biblical King David, they fall. As we all know, and I'm going to present here some information you all know, but it's background and a setting. My original audience really didn't know anything about this. As we all know, who are here today, the place Brigham Young and his pioneer expedition chose to settle in July 1847 was situated in the far northeastern corner of Mexico's Alta California. 3 years later, the Mexican-American War brought Upper California and New Mexico into the United States. Congress created the state of California and the territories of New Mexico and Utah, and tweaked the Texas border. President Millard Fillmore named Brigham Young as Utah's first territorial governor. The other top jobs went to both Mormons and imported political appointees. The Latter-day Saints welcomed this measure of self-government, but they retained earlier skepticism about the motives of public officials at all levels. In July 1857, Brigham Young and his followers celebrated their 10th anniversary in their new western stronghold. In the midst of orations and dances and dinners, word arrived confirming the rumors that U.S. President James Buchanan was sending an army of 1,500 men to Utah. Buchanan had acted on reports alleging treasonous behavior without investigating charges against Utah's government, and with no advance notice to Young. Buchanan selected Alfred Cumming as Young's replacement and ordered the army to escort the new appointee to his post. Even before this was known, Governor Young was preparing for a possible confrontation with Washington. He assumed the worst, as did many of the Mormon settlers. They remembered the armed vigilantes who had forced them from their homes in Missouri and Illinois, and they wondered if yet another expulsion was underway. Utahns were told to conserve wheat and beef cattle, arm themselves with guns and ammunition, and prepare for a possible relocation. Governor Young launched a diplomatic effort through delegates in Washington, while he and other Mormon leaders rallied popular support for his tactical plan with enthusiastic pulpit rhetoric. These were the conditions in Utah Territory when the California-bound pioneers known as the Arkansas Party arrived in early August.
We lost it.
Yeah. I'm back. The wagon train began as two separate clusters of families and friends under company captains Jack Baker and Alexander Fancher. They joined forces soon after their April departure from the rural farm towns of northwestern Arkansas. You can see right there on the sign, it's a marker that's been put up locating the place where they left. As they moved westward, the families kept a similar schedule and often camped close by for an extra measure of security. The first group's leader, Jack Baker, was a 50-year-old farmer. Baker grew up in Alabama, where he was frequently involved in brawls. After learning of Baker's death, a neighbor said Baker was one of her best citizens, a warm friend and a bitter enemy. Jack and Mary moved to Arkansas, but soon saw greater opportunities in California. Hungry gold seekers there.
We need the battery?
It's a battery, probably.
I think the battery's going to do it.
I think so. Fix it next time.
Hungry gold seekers there in California paid premium prices for Midwestern beef, and California ranchers wanted Texas longhorns. Jack and the married son hired extra cowhands to help move 300 head of cattle, horses, and mules west. Mary stayed behind, declaring, "Arkansas is plenty good enough for me, and Arkansas is where I'm going to stay." Baker wrote out his will and left. Baker's group included relatives and neighbors, including the Parker, Mitchell, and two large Dunlap families. The second group, headed by Alexander Fancher, was headed to the Joaquin Valley of Central California. This was Fancher's second trip west. His brother had taken up ranching near Visalia, and now Alexander was moving his farm. Can you hear me now?
What would you like to do?
There's a couple
Let
of
me push the button.
Just push it.
Okay, well, you just hold on to it just for a second. It'll turn back on. As long, I'm not sure. It must be the battery.
I think it's the battery.
You have maybe, yeah.
Yeah. And so now Alexander was moving his family west. Fancher was a Tennessee native, a man in his mid-40s who moved his family to Arkansas in the 1840s. A family history described him as, quote, a farmer, tall, slim, erect, a dark complexion, a singer, and a born leader and organizer of man. with common sense. The Fanchers had been cattlemen for generations, and like the Bakers, were among the land and slave owners of the Ozark Hill Country. Fancher's party included 2 cousins and other residents of Benton County, including the Huff, Jones, Tackett, Poteet, and Cameron families. The Consolidated Arkansas Party entered the Salt Lake Valley in August. Mormon immigration agents directed them to camp west of the Jordan River in an area reserved for the cattle of Gentile immigrants passing through. During their stop in Salt Lake, the composition of the party changed. Some families in the Fancher group pulled out and went north around the Great Salt Lake to follow the northern road to California. Earlier, westbound travelers on the northern route had reported trouble with Shoshone and Bannocks. The immigrants were creating their own problems. Despite warnings posted in guidebooks and cautions from nearby Mormons, those in the wagon train sometimes shot at the Indians, inflicting injuries or death. It was custom among the Indians to seek reparations. A gun, a horse, a saddle, or a white man would be killed to even the score. Several times during the summer of 1857, Mormon agents negotiated settlements to resolve those grievances. Reports of such incidents frustrated Governor Young. He was the territorial Indian superintendent, and his goal was to keep peace. The Saints were saving the California-bound immigrants from their own foolishness. Young was ready to pull back. In a mid-August talk, he said, if fighting commenced between the U.S. Army and the Mormons, he would no longer intervene to protect the immigrants, but let the Indians do as they pleased. Let me tighten this up so I can hold it. After the Arkansas party had rested their livestock, they headed down the southern road to California. Along the way, they traded for needed goods and services with Mormon settlers and local Indians. Seldom did these routine activities strain relationships, except for grain and grass. Brigham Young had placed an embargo on trading grain. He told the Saints to preserve it for their own needs. They could sell it to preserve human life, but not for cattle feed. A bigger issue was access to grazing lands. The Mormons had reserved specific ranges for each season of the year. When a Mormon agent in Provo asked these immigrants to move their 400 cattle off the winter range, the immigrants defended their rights. This is Uncle Sam's grass, the captain said, and we are his boys. We have a better claim on it than a bunch of rebel Mormons. We're staying right here. The Mormon lawman gave them an hour's warning, and they left. Halfway between Salt Lake and the Meadows, the southbound Arkansas party camped on Corn Creek near Kanawha.
Is that correct?
No, back up. Yes, we're there. The immigrants were parking on one side of the creek, and 2 wagons of a northbound Mormon party spent the night on the other side. George A. Smith was in the Mormon company, one of Young's apostles. Smith had been preaching in the southern settlements, encouraging them to build reserves of grain, cattle, guns, and ammunition in preparation for the approaching army. Traveling with Smith's group also was Jacob Hamlin. He was the newly appointed head of the Southern Utah Mission. Also with them were at least 2 Paiute leaders. This party was heading north for consultations with Brigham Young. The immigrants introduced themselves as mostly from Arkansas and said they had from 400 to 50 head of horned cattle, 25 head of horses, and some mules. They asked about road conditions, the disposition of the Indians, and where to graze their stock. Hamlin knew southern Utah and its Indians well. He asked them how many men they had. The spokesman told him, well, they had between 40 and 50 that would do to tie to. Hamlin told them,
So you don't have to do that. I'll hold that and you can present. I'll just hold this on.
that seems to work.
This is do-over. Speak to us.
Hamlin told them they would be safe with half as many men among the peaceful southern Paiutes, quote, if they would keep a good lookout that the Indians did not steal their animals. Hamlin said further that the Mountain Meadows was the best place to recruit their animals before they entered upon the desert. He recommended a place near the large spring at the southern end, away from his home and herds at the upper basin. The people, Hamlin remembered, seemed to be ordinary frontier homespun people as a general thing, but not everyone in the train seemed pleasant. Hamlin recalled that some of the outsiders were rude and rough and calculated to get the ill will of the inhabitants. Indian riders and southbound Mormon travelers informed Cedar City residents of the approaching Arkansas pioneers several days before they arrived. By word of mouth, the settlers learned of conflicts over grazing rights and grain, of moments of harassment, and of the immigrants' impressive cattle herd. Despite optimistic beginnings for Cedar City a half dozen years earlier, the townspeople in 1857 were among the poorest in Utah. The iron business was floundering. One observer said that most of the residents lived in isolation and dire poverty, often going without shoes and warm clothing. They could use some help. Anticipating the Arkansas Company's rival, Isaac C. Haight, Cedar City's most influential leader, spoke publicly about his plan. Mary Campbell remembered Haight saying that, quote, the people in southern Utah needed some stock just then, as if he was giving the citizens a hint to get the stock away from the company. Haight did not mention his intent to reward the local Paiutes with booty if they would carry out a raid on the immigrant herd. Some observers felt that Haight's plan for rustling immigrant cattle was consistent with Brigham Young's war strategy, and that in August, Dimmick Huntington, one of Young's Indian agents, invited Shoshone and Bannock leaders to steal immigrant cattle on the northern trail. They were told to hide the stock in the mountains for Mormon and Indian use in the event of a forced evacuation. Huntington delivered the same message during a meeting in Brigham Young's office with Southern Paiute leaders on Tuesday, September 1st. Huntington said he authorized the Paiutes and the Southern Paiutes to take, quote, all the cattle that had gone to California the south route. It made them open their eyes. The Paiutes reminded Huntington that he had told them not to steal. So I have, Huntington replied, but now they have come to fight us. And if, and you, for when they kill us, they will kill you. Paiute leaders proposed a different solution. Huntington's diary says, they said they was afraid to fight the Americans, and so they would raise grain that we might fight. On Thursday the 3rd, after a trip of 250 miles from Salt Lake, the Arkansas pioneers arrived in Cedar City. While the herdsmen moved the cattle to the grasslands on the far west side of the valley, between 12 and 20 wagons with oxen and horse teams entered the Cedar Fort. You could see you could drive in and drive around that center area, an enclosure of temporary log homes. The wagons arrived around noon and stayed a little over 1 hour while the immigrants shopped for needed foodstuffs and other goods. During their stay, a few incidents drew the attention of the townspeople. One of the men purchased a few pounds of wheat and had it ground at a mill outside the east gate. When the miller asked an exorbitant price for his service, a whole cow, the patron rightfully objected. Others enjoyed the Mormon sagebrush whiskey sold in an adjacent distillery. An observer said they spoke in a loud and excited and boisterous manner, were profaning and threatening to bodily harm and kill some of the citizens, including Bishop Klingensmith. One immigrant claimed that they had helped kill Joseph Smith at Carthage, Hancock County, Illinois, and other Mormons in Nauvoo and Missouri, and that they would kill some more yet. Nephi Johnson, a young farmer skilled in Paiute dialect, was visiting Cedar City that day. He recalled this: "The company was of a mixed class, some being perfect gentlemen, while others were very boastful and insulting, as they said that they were coming back and insist Johnson's army to exterminate the Mormons. I did hear Captain Fancher, who was the leader of the emigrant, rebuke the boastful ones of the company for making these threats." When the city mayor, Isaac Haight, heard of these incidents, he ordered the town marshal, John M. Higby, to arrest the troublemakers. Territorial ordinances declared that anyone publicly intoxicated so as to endanger the peace and quiet of the community shall be liable to arrest and fined. The law also said profaning the name of God was subject to a fine. Higby aimed charges of profanity and disorderly conduct against the horsemen. He refused to be taken, and his companions stood by him and dared the Mormons to arrest any of them. Higby was forced to draw back. The immigrants had not unhitched their teams. They left the fort, headed across the valley, and camped for the night. The next morning they moved along Leach's cutoff for a 2-day drive to the Meadows, where they arrived Saturday afternoon, September 5th. Notice the slave in the background?
Oh, wow.
Meanwhile, reactions to these incidents led to a meeting of community leaders. Haight and some others wanted to call out the militia to help Higby's 16-member police force arrest the offending immigrants at their nearby camp. To involve the militia, Haight would need the approval of Colonel William H. Dame, head of the military district in southern Utah. Dame lived 20 miles north in Parowan. Haight's letter arrived by courier late at night. It recounted the unbearable slanders, the swearing, the altercations, and most importantly, the military threats made by the immigrants. Colonel Dame convened a council of advisors to evaluate Haight's request. The council's decision was that, quote, all possible means should be used to keep the peace until the immigrants should leave and proceed upon their journey. Dame's adjutant remembered the colonel's advice. Do not notice their threats. Words are but wind. They injure no one. But if the immigrants commit acts of violence against citizens, inform me by express, and such measures will be adopted as ensure tranquility. The 44-year-old Isaac Haight was one of the most educated and experienced men in southern Utah. In most situations, he trusted his own judgment. In Nauvoo, Illinois, he was a city policeman, a loyal follower and defender of Joseph Smith. Haight was doing sentry duty at the Nauvoo Temple when he heard of Smith's murder. He left for the West with deep feelings. He was ready to abandon for good what he called this wicked nation stained with the blood of the prophets. Haight accepted Young's call to move to Cedar City in 1853. 2 years after completing mission in England. One by one, Young gave Haight authority to oversee religious, economic, and civil affairs of the Iron Mission. Haight stood 1 inch short of 6 feet tall. He weighed 170 pounds. His family remembered him as a friendly man of light spirit who relished amusements, including music. John D. Lee, his neighbor, and sometime adversary, saw Haight as a man of pride, ambition, and zeal. Later on, Lee said approvingly that Haight had almost become a terror to evil doers. Haight's confidence worked against the need to accept Dame as his superior. Other men in southern Utah shared Haight's view of the situation. They acknowledged Dame's positive reputation for being honest in his dealings, truthful in the ordinary affairs of life, and very kind to the poor. Yet many saw Dame as one of the most timid of men. He disliked personal confrontations and hard decisions. A fellow Mormon said Dame was, quote, a man that wished to push off all the responsible things that were not agreeable for him to shoulder onto those of others. It was a weakness that cost him prestige among some of his best friends. Haight must have felt annoyed by Dame's response to his urgent request. Lacking authority to use the militia to arrest the offending emigrants, Haight found another option. As we noted earlier, Brigham Young had announced a new Indian policy in his August 16th sermon in Salt Lake's Adobe Tabernacle. Young had said that if the U.S. Army entered Utah, the Saints would no longer protect the immigrants who were causing trouble with Indians on the northern trail. Southern Utah settlers soon connected Young's sermon to the Indian raids on cattle. Haight himself may have used Young's words to justify his decision to use the Southern Paiutes to do what he wanted. We don't have any absolute evidence on that, but there is a similarity. After reviewing Dame's message, Haight and other Cedar City leaders agreed to, quote, arm the Indians, give them provisions and ammunition, and send them after the immigrants to give them a brush and take their cattle. To make the plan work, Haight had to stir up the generally peaceful Paiutes, and get someone to lead them, someone who was strong, zealous, and had influenced the Indians. For that, Haight turned to John D. Lee. Thank you. A courier carried the invitation to Lee at Fort Harmony, a 15-mile ride south from Cedar City. Lee was a government-appointed farmer to the Paiutes and head of the Washington County militia. Earlier, Haight had asked a local Mexican war veteran the best way to make an attack on the train. The soldier said they should attack when the immigrants were moving. If they attacked the camp, he told Haight, the immigrants would whip the Indians. The California road went west from Cedar City along Leach's Cutoff to Pinto, and then southwest to the Mountain Meadows. Hamlin was building a small ranch house by a spring in the north end. The wagon campsite lay 4 miles to the south. A dozen miles further south, the road descended into a very steep incline and in a narrow canyon of the Santa Clara River. This gorge forced settlers to string out along a narrow trail that wound through groves of trees. It was known as an ideal place for thieves, and thieves had been active in that area. The Paiutes were, quote, to follow the immigrant train along the river and at some opportune point attack the train, kill as many of the men as they could and get away with as much cattle and spoil as possible, but not harm the women and children. The plan to kill, instead of arrest the offending men, was a further escalation of Haight's original plan. About the time Lee arrived in Cedar City, Haight sent 3 young men to the Meadows to set the new plan in motion. Part of their assignment was to find evidence that would justify the Indians being let loose upon the immigrants. They were also to get the company to move on, in an effort to hurry them into the trap in Santa Clara Canyon. With the messengers on their way, Haight and Lee retired to Haight's partially built new stone house near the ironworks. They talked most of the night, exploring options for dealing with the rough and abusive immigrants. According to Lee, Haight concluded it was best to put them out of the way before they did any more harm. Later, when emotions cooled and the crime was apparent, Haight's friends blamed Lee for proposing the severe punishment. After the massacre, Lee claimed that Haight put him under military orders and claimed they had come from Colonel Dane. The most likely scenario was that the 2 men were partners, but with some differences. The energetic Haight wanted order, security, and perhaps some payback for past wrongs. Lee's world centered on his belief in an imminent millennium. He relished a meaningful role in what he supposed to be God's purpose. Both of them wanted to settle old scores with the Gentiles and take cattle and other spoils. Haight and Lee were quick to make judgments and execute on those decisions. These are hallmarks of extra-legal justice already active on the American frontier. With an agreement in place, Haight and Lee set about recruiting Indians for the task. On Saturday afternoon, September 5th, they invited the town marshal, John M. Higby, who was a militia officer, and Philip Klingensmith, the bishop of the Cedar City congregation, to join them. These four men rode to the summer camp of the Coal Creek Band of Paiutes and met with available sub-chiefs. Along, a group of Paiute men headed off along Leech's Cutoff with a mission to kill and loot. They stopped just short of the meadows in a long canyon near Pinto. This town was a settlement of Mormon missionaries to the Indians. Meanwhile, Lee returned to Fort Harmony and enlisted additional Paiutes with promise of booty. The following morning, after Sunday's worship service in Harmony, he led them to the designating meeting place near a potato patch planted by the Pinto missionaries. Every Sunday afternoon in Cedar City, Isaac Haight presided over a council of local opinion makers, lay leaders in the church, high councilmen. Many of them also held civic and militia positions. They functioned somewhat like a New England town council. For Latter-day Saints, reaching unity in councils was the accepted way to resolve important issues. On that Sunday, September 6th, Haight shared the highlights of his plan for dealing with the offensive members of the Arkansas Party. Not all of the High Council came from Cedar City. The attendees from outlying areas knew nothing about the situation. They objected to such harsh measures. At one point during the heated discussion, Haight jumped up, broke up the meeting, and went outdoors. Eventually, to resolve the standoff, Haight accepted a proposal to lay the matter before Brigham Young. The president's views far outweighed anyone else's in the territory. Haight seemed confident that Young would understand his dilemma. His opponents believed that Young would side with them. On Sunday afternoon, Haight dispatched two like-minded friends, William Stewart and Joe White, to visit the potato patch near Pinto. They carried a letter instructing Lee to, quote, keep the Indians off the immigrants and protect them from harm until further orders. Haight's written inquiry to Brigham Young left Cedar City with the Courier on Monday afternoon. Before that express rider left, Haight received word through an Indian runner that Lee and the Indians had already launched a premature attack on the immigrants at their campsite in the Lower Meadows. The assault took place early Monday before Stewart and White arrived with their message. Rediscovered sources that had been hidden away for a long time provided us with the details explaining Lee's break with the original plan. While camped at the potato patch, the Indians were lounging, waiting for the evening meal of roasted corn and potatoes. A Paiute leader dozed off and dreamed that his double hands were filled with blood. He awoke with a start. John D. Lee was a dreamer too. His life story includes many prophetic dramas and many prophetic dreams and their fulfillment. Apparently it was Lee who interpreted the double handful of blood as a victory for the red men, that they would secure the blood of the immigrants. With this reassurance, Lee acted. He later put the blame on the Paiutes, claiming that he could not hold the Indians back. In Haight's mind, Lee was ambitious, eager, and overconfident, unpredictable when given a little power. Another of Lee's associates complained that John D. Lee was an aspiring, glory-seeking man who ran before he was sent. Just before daybreak on Monday, the Indians were set in place for the attack. Some hid in a deep channel that drained the Lower Meadows, 25 yards south of the canal. This little lower place there, gully. Others crouched behind the crest of low hills to the west. Lee waited with Paiutes poised to round up the cattle up a ways. The Paiutes used face paint for ceremony. Lee painted his face for disguise. Before they could act, Lee's hastily laid plan fell apart. Instead of rushing the sleeping immigrants in the dark, the Paiutes waited for early daylight. As the Indians held back, early risers in the corral got up and lit the campfires. 200 yards to the northeast, Lee climbed a low hill where he startled a night watchman. The man spirited toward the safety of the main cattleman's camp with Lee in pursuit. As the man stooped to enter one of the tents, Lee shot him dead. The man at the corral went for their guns. Some of the Paiutes rushed toward the wagons, only to be repulsed in the exchange of fire. After a second attempt, daylight made further efforts unwise. Both sides had suffered casualties. While Lee and the Indians took charge of the grazing cattle, the immigrants shoved their wagons into a tighter circle and linked them with chains. Inside this wagon fortress, they dug a semicircular ditch 4 or 5 feet deep, with a protective dirt wall for women and children. The bows and arrows and firearms of the attackers had inflicted serious damage. The pre-dawn attack had killed 6 people. Alexander Fancher was one of them. 3 or 4 others would die of their wounds in the days to follow. Jack Baker was wounded. On Tuesday, the Indians convinced Lee to lead a final direct assault on the camp. Balls from the Ozark sharpshooters' rifles penetrated Lee's hat, his shirt, and his pants without injury. For Lee, the holes in his clothing were a sign of divine protection. This did not impress his fellow fighters. The brother of a prominent leader of the Paiute bandits, Santa Clara, lay dead. 2 Paiute sub-chiefs from Cedar City suffered severe injuries to their legs, and others were wounded. Lee had promised an easy job, but that presumed a target strung out in the Santa Clara Narrows. Lee sent the finest horses to Fort Harmony with his son-in-law. Lee had promised them to the Paiutes. To contain the immigrants, Lee posted watchmen on surrounding hills. They exchanged shots with the immigrants off and on throughout the week. During the 5-day siege, life inside the wagon stronghold became extremely difficult. The immigrants were running low on ammunition. They risked their lives to get fresh water from a nearby spring. William Stewart and Joel White, the 2 men sent out Sunday evening to call off Lee, arrived in the upper meadows Monday morning. They learned from the ranch hands in the north end of the pre-dawn attacks, and that 2 men had left the meadows on Sunday looking for stray cattle. They were William Aden, the young Tennessee sign painter, and a companion known by the Mormons as the Dutchman. Stewart and White set after them, hoping to contain the unraveling situation at the meadows. They found the herders halfway through the canyon, watering their horses at a spring. When the unsuspecting Aden turned his back to reach for a drinking cup, Stewart shot him in the head. The Dutchman spurred his horse and raced off, with Joe White firing after him. He was wounded, but he reached the corral with word that a Mormon had killed Aden. The immigrants already knew John D. Lee's involvement. Here was new evidence of Mormon intent. When Stewart and White reached Cedar City that afternoon, they reported the initial attacks in their encounter in the canyon. They told Haight that Lee was ready to pull the Indians off and let the immigrants leave. Haight rejected the idea. Lee did not yet know of Aden's death. If word got out that Mormons were killing Arkansas immigrants, the lives of the entire community might be at risk. Haight decided that any immigrant old enough to talk must die. Tuesday afternoon, he called out 12 or so city militiamen and sent them to the meadows. They were told to help bury the dead and round up the cattle. But as Haight confided to Nephi Johnson, the troops would have to kill them first. The orders that were carried to Lee were to finish the dirty little job that he had started. The Cedar City recruits reached the meadows after dark Tuesday night. A few men from Washington and Santa Clara, recruited by Lee, had already arrived. More than 50 militiamen and a similar number of Paiutes awaited orders. On Wednesday morning the 9th, Major Lee gathered the local military, civic, and religious leaders for a council. When Lee shared the plan to kill anyone old enough to talk, the men refused. They asked to see the written military orders from Colonel Dame. Lacking these orders, Lee had no alternative but to accept the council's decision. Major Lee dispatched Klingesmith and Higby to confer with Dame. They reached Cedar City late Wednesday night, but Haight was not there. He had gone to seek Colonel Dame's approval. Haight could lay responsibility for Monday's attack on Lee. He needed Dame to bear the burden of the mass murder. Haight and his associate, Elias Morris, a religious advisor and military captain, reached Parowan near midnight. Once again, Dame assembled a council to consider Haight's concern. The council decided, quote, that the company should be protected, if possible, from Indian violence. The council presumed that it would take no military pressure to pull the Paiutes back. Instead, the council advised compromise with the Indians, if possible, by letting them take all the stock and go to their home and let the company alone. The council cautioned, but on no conditions are you to precipitate a war with the Indians while there is an army marching against our people. In other words, if we were invaded by a hostile U.S. army, Utahns would need a solid Indian alliance. After the council adjourned, Haight and Morris sat with Dame on a pile of tanning bark near the Fort Parowan gate. For the first time, Haight told Dame that the immigrants probably knew of Lee's involvement on Monday's attack and of Mormon complicity in Aiden's death. Haight falsely claimed that most of the immigrants were dead. He emphasized the need to kill any who could reveal Mormon involvement. Finally, he said, the Indians will not do the job alone. Shortly after the massacre, Dame told Jacob Hamlin that the final decision at this infamous Tan Bark Council was about consequences. Dame said, quote, Lee and the Indians had commenced it, and it had to be done. For if it should come to the ears of President Buchanan, it would endanger the lives of the brethren. A massacre participant summed it up this way. It seemed to become necessary to kill all the Arkansas immigrants to silence the rest. Haight had prevailed over the pliable Colonel Dame, but after Haight left the Tan Bark Council, Dame reconsidered his support. Haight didn't change his mind until he visited the Meadows himself. After viewing the carnage, she said, I would give a world if I had it, if we had abided by the decisions of the council. Haight left the Tan Bark Council believing Dame's approval was firm. Thursday afternoon in Cedar City, Haight and his militia captains recruited 24 men and sent them off to the Meadows. Additional Indians and the young interpreter Nephi Johnson joined them in the march through the canyon. Those who had deplored vigilante violence against their own people in Missouri and Illinois were now about to virtually follow the same pattern of violence against others, but on a deadlier scale. Early Friday morning, September 11th, Major Lee convened a council of Indian and white leaders in a ravine near Jacob Hamlin's summer shanty. Major Higbee shared with them the orders he brought to the Meadows. The immigrants, he said, were to be decoyed out and destroyed with the exception of the small children who were too young to tell tales. And, said Higbee, if the Indians cannot do it without help, we must help them. Lee offered to use his glib tongue to convince the immigrants to leave their wagon corral. The Indian leaders agreed to help only after Lee promised them the immigrants' guns and their best horses. When all were satisfied, the Paiute leaders informed their men in the main camp in the hills east of the wagon corral. The highly democratic Paiute culture allowed each man to make his own decision, and many of them were still not convinced. Those who agreed to participate moved quietly along the hillside out of sight of the immigrants. They took positions in the heavy cedar and the sagebrush near the valley's midpoint. When the time came, they would help Mormon militiamen ambush the women and children, killing all but the youngest. Major Lee and Major Higbee gathered their men from 2 militia camps a half-mile east and out of sight of the wagon corral. The troops formed into a military hollow square. Lee explained the situation, reviewed the Indians' role, and issued the orders. At a certain point on the road leading out of the lower meadows, Major Higbee would shout the word halt, and the militia would shoot the immigrant men and older boys with them. Even for those who knew their mission, these words revealed a new reality. Nephi Johnson said a good many of the militia objected, but they didn't dare say anything. They remembered too well how military discipline had been enforced during the recent Walker Indian War. With the troops informed, Higby led them toward the corral fortress. They stopped at an intersection in the California road, just out of gunshot range, but within sight of the immigrants. Lee's task now was to convince the immigrant leaders that the Mormons were there to rescue them from the Indian marauders. He entered the corral under a white flag and offered the desperate immigrants a way out, but under stringent conditions. The Indians were determined on their destruction, he said. The Mormon settlers dared not oppose the Indians, for we were at their mercy. The immigrants could take a few belongings in 2 Mormon wagons. They should lay their arms in the bottom of the wagon and cover them with bedclothes and start for the settlement as soon as possible. And they must trust themselves in our hands. The plan was for the wagons to carry the small children and wounded. The immigrant women would follow the wagons and the men next. The troops to stand in readiness on the east side of the road, ready to receive them. The strategy resembled the original plan for the Santa Clara Canyon, only with greater consequence. Once the immigrants had left the protection of the wagon fort and were strung out on the road, the militia and the Indians would destroy them. The massacre happened as planned. Lee and the 2 loaded wagons moved north through the meadows to the midpoint and over the rim of the basin, out of sight of the women and older children, who walked a half-mile behind them. 24 Arkansas men brought up the rear, with armed Mormon escorts at their side, man to man. John M. Higby rode just ahead of the men. When he gave the order to halt, each militiaman raised his gun and shot the man at his side. Horsemen who had been posted for this duty chased down and killed 2 or 3 men whose escort did not or could not pull the trigger. The sound of gunshots signaled the Indians to rush from their hiding places and kill the women and older children with bows and arrows, guns, knives, or rocks. At the head of the line, Lee and the wagon drivers shot or cut the throats of the wounded and aged. As militia leaders and the Paiutes made certain that all adults were dead, Bishop Klingensmith collected the 17 children under age 6. Using a militia baggage wagon, Klingensmith drove them to the ranch house and left them in the care of Rachel Hamlin for the night. 2 of the children showed outward wounds. Sarah Frances Baker's ear was bleeding, and little Sarah Ann Dunlap's arm oozed at the elbow, the bone being completely severed. The inner damage was still worse. Young hearts and minds in terrible trauma. Though they had not had peaceful rest in days, the children cried all night. I wrote this last 3 chapters. I cannot read those last words without crying. The children cried all night. Over the next few days, Klingensmith distributed these orphan children among Mormon families, where they remained for nearly 2 years. The Mormons baptized them and gave them new names. They were adopted. The Arkansans appealed through their senator to the government in Washington. They sent a request to Utah, and Brigham Young directed Jacob Hamlin to collect them from the Mormon families. Federal officials returned the orphan children to relatives in Arkansas. The Express writer, carrying Haight's letter seeking Brigham Young's advice, reached his office on September 10th, the day before the massacre, after an exhausting 3-day journey. He found Young and a dozen or so church leaders listening to Jacob Hamlin explain how the Indians cached grain over the winter without it spoiling. Hamlin recalled that Haight wanted permission to chastise the Indians. According to Hamlin, Young answered rather hastily, saying, "No, they have a perfect right to pass. When I want martial law proclaimed, I'll let you know. You will know it." Young told the courier that the Indians must be kept from the immigrants at all costs, if it took all of Iron County to protect them. After an hour's rest and a quick lunch, the expressman returned for Young's written reply and headed back down the road. He arrived in Cedar City on Sunday morning, the 13th, 2 days after the massacre. Young's letter explained that the U.S. Army, now fewer than 900 men, would winter near Fort Bridger. Young continued, in regard to immigration trains passing through the settlement, we must not interfere with them until they first are notified to keep away. You must not meddle with them. If those who are there will leave, let them go in peace. Within moments, Haight knew that Young did not support his action. Haight's life would never be the same. He had rejected the decisions of Colonel Dane's counsels and the wisdom of his own advisors. Haight broke into sustained sobs. His only words were, "Too late, too late." Those who planned the massacre at Mountain Meadows covered their crime by shaming the participants into silence and by shifting responsibilities to the Indians. In 1859, federal investigators broke through that wall of silence and indicted 9 men they believed responsible for the crime. John D. Lee was the only one captured and convicted of murder. Philip Klingensmith turned state's evidence and as a lapsed Mormon testified in 1875 at Lee's first abortive trial. 1 year later, it was the testimony of Nephi Johnson and Jacob Hamblin that convinced a second jury of Lee's guilt. Lee chose death by firing squad and was executed at Mountain Meadows in March 1877. You can see Lee standing by his, sitting on his coffin right here. Lee chose death by firing squad and was executed at Mountain Meadows in March 1877. That August, Brigham Young died in Salt Lake City. Lee's execution led many people to place all responsibility for the massacre on him. He refused to implicate Brigham Young or others. Lee insisted that Young first learned of the massacre after it happened. Isaac Haight spent most of his latter life in hiding. He died alone under an assumed name in Arkansas, in Arizona, in 1886, and was buried in the basement of an old hotel. Klingensmith likewise spent years on the run. Where he died around 1902 is not known. Federal prosecutors dropped charges against William H. Dane and John M. Higbee, citing a lack of sufficient evidence to convict. Just about there. Some years after the massacre, Brigham Young said that the men who were ordered to the Meadows by the militia officers should bear no guilt, that the horrid memories of the massacre burned their hearts and burdened their hearts and their minds throughout their lives. The Senator John McCain said of American soldiers who served in Vietnam, "For many, it is the stuff of nightmares that last years beyond the experience." Nephi Johnson, the interpreter who delivered the Paiutes their orders to kill, died in 1919 at age 86, still haunted by his experience. His last troubled words were blood, blood, blood. Johnson had invited local schoolteacher Juanita Brooks to write his story, but he died before the young teacher came to learn what he knew. Brooks spent many years afterwards seeking answers to the questions that haunted the people of southern Utah. In 1950, she published a groundbreaking study of the massacre, shifting the full responsibility away from Lee. We who write today build upon the foundation of openness and honest inquiry that she laid. In 1955, Brooks spoke at the dedication of a monument in Harrison, Arkansas, erected by the victims' families. Hers was the first attempt by a Latter-day Saint to reach out to the families of those murdered at Mountain Meadows. Back up, back up, back up, right there. One more.
Back.
Forward. One more, forward. Right there. The monument erected at the Meadows in the 1990 up on the hill, and the second remembrance, the gravesite memorial, built 9 years later by the Mormon Church, reflect a renewed commitment to memorialize the victims and work toward reconciliation. That effort continued on the 150th anniversary of the massacre. Descendant groups held memorial services in their churches and at the Meadows. The Latter-day Saint apostle read an official expression of, quote, profound regret for the massacre. What was done here, he said, long ago by members of our church represents a terrible and inexcusable departure from Christian teaching and conduct. We cannot change what happened, but we can remember and honor those who were killed here. The book that Ron, Rick, and I wrote is one small part of a broader collaborative effort to encourage healing and understanding through open dialogue about one of America's darkest days. Do we have a minute for questions?
In addition to Lee, how many Mormons were present for the first attack?
We don't know. The story involves Lee and some others who were there, but the militiamen themselves wouldn't admit it. In fact, none of them spoke. They kept it a secret. They're afraid to be punished by Lee or Haig. We don't know, but there were some. In the final killing, we say there was 50-50. Early in this talk, I said one of the participants said the Mormons did most of the killing. In other words, a lot of the Indians who didn't like to do that didn't. So when Nephi Johnson said, let's go get them, it wasn't just Southern Paiutes, but it was an unknown number of Mormon militiamen, including Johnson, who helped kill the women and children.
I've read in one source that 69 Mormons were identified by name as having participated in some manner.
Yes, in our book, Rick Turley, who was the executive director there at the, not executive, he was the managing director at the museum, had some staff members do the research on all of the militiamen in southern Utah and looked at all sources they could to determine how many participated in some form, and that's the list that has that number. Some would have been there early and left, some would have been there and done nothing. Like the militiamen lined up man to man, they were supposed to turn and shoot the guy, and most of them got shot right in the head. Some just couldn't. And so there were others up there waiting to chase people down. They're counted as well. But the number that is generally given for those present is 50-50, 50 of each, but those are estimates. Yes?
I'm curious, did most of your information come from journals or from the court case or from books?
We set out this way. We said, we know what the Mormon story is, and it's not true. It's hiding things. We know what the anti-Mormon is, and it's not true either. It's exaggerating things. And so we said, we're going to go in blind, not knowing what the real answer is. And if it comes up with bad news, that's the way we'll publish it. So we went after every source we could, and our standard was go as far back in time as we can and get the information that was there at the time. Because over time, stories change. And then we said, okay, here's a fact. We need a second fact that's just like it. Two witnesses, in a sense, before we are at it. You notice I hedged a little bit on a couple of things. May have been, we didn't have a corroborating piece of evidence. But the sources include journals, diaries, minutes. Lee's trial brings forth a lot, because the second trial, where Hamlin and Nephi Johnson, they were there, and Hamlin had heard things from others who wouldn't talk because they were being challenged. They laid out the story which was clear evidence that Lee was involved in it. And of course, Haight should have been captured also. He changed his name and went into hiding, and anyway. So those were the top two men, as you could see in the story, and they were blaming each other. And of course, they both had a role to play there. Yes.
Why did they execute John Lee at the site? And where did they bury him?
He didn't ask to go there, did he? Did I say that? No. I've forgotten who decided, but I think the